David and Martha Cooper moved into the old house on Hawthorne Lane in early spring. It was a quiet neighborhood, full of sleepy porches, cracked sidewalks, and homes that all looked like they had stories to tell, if only someone would listen. They didn't have much. After David lost his job in the city and Martha's health took a turn, they were looking for a fresh start somewhere slow, somewhere affordable. The house was a bit run down, but it had charm: creaky wood floors, ivy on the fence, and a decent-sized backyard where their dog, Buster, could roam freely. Buster was old, almost 12, a golden lab with a limp in his back leg and cloudy eyes that had once been bright amber. He had been with them through everything: the move, the miscarriages, the long, quiet years. But within the first week of living in that house, Buster changed. It started small. Every morning after his breakfast, he would trot outside, stiffly, like his joints hurt, and go straight to one spot in the yard. Near the back fence, under a dying apple tree, he would begin to dig. At first, David thought it was cute. "He's making a nest," he laughed to Martha, watching the dog scoop up small piles of dirt with shaky paws. "Maybe there's a squirrel down there." But by the third day, Buster's digging was no longer casual. He became obsessed with that spot. He ignored the rest of the yard. He stopped chasing birds. He barely responded to calls unless it was time to eat. And even then, he'd only gulp down his food and return to that patch of ground. Martha frowned one afternoon as she watched him through the kitchen window. "He's gonna hurt himself," she murmured. "Look at his paws. They're raw." David went out that evening to fill in the hole, thinking maybe if he covered it up, Buster would forget about it. But the next morning, just after sunrise, Buster was out there again, panting, pacing, digging furiously like something in the dirt was calling to him. By the end of the first week, there was a hole the size of a kiddie pool in the backyard. Neighbors began to notice. A woman walking her poodle leaned over the fence one morning and asked if they were burying something. A boy on his bike stopped to stare at the dog, digging in silence, dirt flying behind him. "He doesn't even bark anymore," David muttered one night, watching Buster sleep restlessly. "It's like he's not even himself." Then Buster stopped eating. He would sniff his food, maybe nibble at it, then go back outside, even in the rain, even after dark, and dig. He began whining in his sleep, legs twitching. Sometimes he growled at the ground. David made an appointment with the vet. "You said he's 12?" the vet asked, lifting Buster's ears and checking his eyes. "He's in rough shape. Arthritis, likely some pain in the hips. But his vitals are steady. No fever, no infection. And you said the behavior started when exactly?" David hesitated. "The day we moved in." The vet raised an eyebrow. "Has he done anything like this before?" "No," David said. "Never." The vet sighed, handed him a pamphlet on canine dementia, and said, "Sometimes older dogs fixate. It can happen. Keep him comfortable. But if he stops drinking water, call me." But something about it didn't feel like dementia. Buster wasn't confused. He was focused. That night, around 3 a.m., David woke up to a sound he hadn't heard in weeks: barking. He rushed to the back door and saw Buster standing at the edge of the hole, no longer digging, just barking into the dark earth like there was something inside, something listening. David stepped outside, barefoot, freezing. "Buster, come!" The dog looked at him, then turned and let out a low growl. Not at David, but at the ground. Then he whimpered, sat down, and didn't move. The next morning, Martha found a thin shard of metal in the hole. It was old, rusted, and jagged, looked almost like a piece of a lock or latch. David tossed it aside, but over the next few days more pieces surfaced. A chipped ceramic doll's hand, a nail, a strip of dark cloth so old it fell apart in his fingers. And then, on the 10th day, a small splintered piece of wood, barely the size of a shoebox lid, with faded writing burned into it. Emily, 1978. Martha's hand flew to her mouth. That's a name. They sat in silence for a long time. Later that night, David did something he hadn't done in years. He Googled, he typed the address, then Emily and 1978 and Roosevelt County. It took a while to find it. The articles were buried deep, forgotten by the internet. But when he saw the words, his blood went cold. Body of missing girl never recovered. Disappearance still unsolved. Last seen playing near the apple tree behind her family's house on Hawthorne Lane. It was their house, their backyard. That spot. Martha read over his shoulder. No, she whispered. Number? That can't be. David clicked through images, grainy, scanned newspaper clippings. One photo showed a little girl with pigtails and a shy smile. Another showed the backyard, untouched, fresh grass, an old apple tree, and a search team with shovels. They had dug years ago, but they never found her until now. Buster began digging again the next morning, more furiously than ever. His paws were bleeding, his breathing ragged, but he wouldn't stop. David tried to pull him away, but the dog cried, not in pain, but desperation. That afternoon, they called the sheriff. The backyard became a crime scene, and what they uncovered made national headlines. The yard was swarming with people by noon. Police cars, a coroner's van, 2 detectives in plain clothes, and an officer stringing up yellow tape across the fence. Neighbors stood on porches or behind curtains, whispering. They found the remains just before sunset, small, fragile, bones curled in on themselves like a child sleeping, some still wrapped in faded fabric, a tattered blue dress preserved by time and soil. There was no doubt it was her, Emily Carter, age 7, missing since October 1978. The sheriff, a broad man with a gray mustache and sun-creased skin, shook his head slowly as they loaded the remains into a body bag. 45 years, he said, almost to himself. She was here the whole time. Martha stood on the porch, wrapped in a blanket, staring at the hole. Buster lay nearby, head on his paws, tail still for the first time in weeks. His breathing was shallow, but peaceful. He hadn't moved since the body was uncovered. He knew, Martha whispered. He knew where she was. David sat beside her, eyes still wide. He didn't just know. He couldn't stop until she was found. The next few days passed in a haze of questions. Reporters came knocking. One station tried to sneak a drone over the yard. David chased it off with a shovel. The story went viral. Dog solves 45-year-old cold case. People left flowers at the fence. Someone mailed a drawing of Buster with angel wings and a gold medal. But the town's shock soon turned into speculation. Who did it? How was she buried there? And how did no one notice back then? According to old records, the Carters had rented the house briefly. Their daughter disappeared on a Saturday afternoon. One minute she was playing in the yard, the next, gone. No witnesses, no signs of a struggle, only the old apple tree standing silent in the sun. The original owner after them, a single man named Franklin Meyer, a recluse, worked nights, moved out 3 years later, no forwarding address. He'd passed away in 2002, no family, no confession. But one detail stuck. Franklin had owned a dog, too, an old black mutt, according to records, died around the same time he moved, buried somewhere in the yard, but no one ever found the grave. Maybe he tried to bury two secrets, the detective said quietly. One didn't stay buried. Buster stopped eating again. They took him to the vet. His heart was weakening. His eyes were dimmer than ever. But still, every day, he limped out to that hole, now filled in and covered with a temporary marker, and lay beside it. "He's grieving," Martha said, placing a hand on his back. David nodded. He didn't just find her, he carried her story. They tried to comfort him. New toys, soft blankets, even bits of cooked chicken. Nothing stirred him. Until one night, Martha played music, not on purpose. Just an old tune on the radio, a lullaby from the 70s, soft and slow. And Buster raised his head. He stared at the window, whined, then laid back down. Martha turned off the radio, her eyes wet. That was a song from that decade, from her time. "Maybe she used to sing it," David whispered. They didn't say the thought out loud, not completely, but both felt it. Buster hadn't just smelled bones or fabric. He had remembered something, felt it, and once she was found, it was like a weight had lifted from him, but his strength was fading. They took him to the vet again 2 weeks later. "He's old," the vet said gently, "and he's tired. Some dogs just choose when they're ready." The vet offered options. They refused. "He deserves to choose for himself," David said. "He's earned that." The town held a memorial service for Emily Carter. Her family, what remained of it, came in from out of state. Her younger brother, now a man in his 50s, gave a speech, said he remembered her laugh and how she always hummed when she played outside. He paused mid-sentence, holding back tears, then said, "She was never truly gone. She just waited for the right soul to bring her back." After the service, he knelt beside Buster, now lying under a tree near the ceremony, and placed a small pink ribbon beside his paw. "Thank you," he said, "for not forgetting her." That night, Buster didn't move much. He didn't eat. But in the early hours of morning, as the sun rose pale and gold over Hawthorne Lane, Martha found him on the porch. His body was still, his eyes closed, and beside him, tucked gently under his paw, was the piece of wood they had found weeks ago, the one that read, "Emily, 1978. They buried Buster beneath the apple tree, not in the center of the yard, but just beside the spot where he'd dug for days, the same spot where Emily Carter had rested in silence for nearly half a century. The town granted permission without hesitation. Even the mayor showed up quietly, without a press crew. David built the headstone himself, a small slab of river rock with Buster's name carved by hand, nothing fancy. He never gave up, so we wouldn't forget. Beneath it, Martha planted a ring of wildflowers, bluebells, daisies, and purple coneflowers, the type Emily might have picked had she been allowed to grow up. News of the dog's devotion had spread far beyond Roosevelt County. People sent letters, drawings, dog treats, and laminated photos of their own pets. Children's classes made thank-you cards addressed to Buster the Hero. One letter, from a little girl in Montana, said, "I think Buster was her angel." The Coopers tried to keep things quiet, but grief has its own rhythm, and mourning is never the same twice. For Martha, the silence left by Buster's absence was deafening. For David, it opened something he hadn't realized he'd closed, a need to do more. So he began writing, not for an audience, not for the news, just for himself. He wrote about the first day they brought Buster home, how he'd run into the screen door twice before figuring it out. He wrote about the time Buster got lost during a thunderstorm and showed up 12 hours later, completely dry, with someone's hot dog bun in his mouth. He wrote about the look in the dog's eyes during that final week, how it wasn't fear or confusion, but peace. He finished what he came here to do, David wrote, and then he let go. The town installed a plaque on the sidewalk outside the Cooper home, in memory of Buster who never stopped digging until the truth was free. Tourists started to visit. Some took pictures. Others just stood quietly in front of the gate, reading the story printed on a weatherproof sign that had been installed at the edge of the yard. But the most surprising change came from within the community itself. The city reopened the Carter case files, not for prosecution, since the prime suspect had long since passed, but for transparency. Investigators released a full timeline, old evidence, and details that had never made it into the news. A podcast picked up the story, then a documentary crew. Emily Carter's story, once a closed, dusty folder, was now taught in local schools as a lesson in listening to intuition, to memory, to dogs, to each other. The Coopers were invited to speak at a memorial event, but they declined. Instead, they submitted a recording, a soft-voiced audio file where Martha simply said, "You don't have to dig to uncover something important, but sometimes when someone won't stop, maybe it's because the world forgot something it wasn't supposed to." Then she thanked Buster and turned off the microphone. Years passed. The apple tree blossomed again. For the first time in decades, it bore fruit. Martha said it felt like a gift. One afternoon, a young girl, no more than 7, placed a red apple gently on Buster's grave. She didn't say anything, just nodded once, as if offering something sacred. Her father stood nearby, holding a leash. A golden retriever sat beside him, tail wagging slowly, ears perked. "I'm going to name her Emily," the girl said. David, watching from the porch, felt a lump rise in his throat. "That's a beautiful name," he replied. "Was that the dog that found the girl?" she asked. He nodded. "Yes, he was very special." "Do you think dogs remember things?" she asked. "I do," David said quietly. "More than we think, sometimes better than we do." That night, Martha lit a candle in the window. She didn't say why. She didn't have to. People remembered now, and sometimes that was enough. But one detail still remained, something only David knew. 3 days after Buster died, he'd been clearing the yard when he noticed something tucked beneath the porch, half buried in the soil. At first, he thought it was trash, but when he brushed the dirt away, he found a second piece of wood, smaller, older, nearly rotted through. It was carved by hand with tiny, uneven letters. Barely legible, it read, "She told me to dig." David kept that piece in a locked drawer. He never showed anyone, because deep down he wasn't sure what scared him more, that someone had written it, or that Buster hadn't needed anyone to. 10 years passed. Hawthorne Lane had changed. A few new houses, new fences, fresh coats of paint on old porches. But the Cooper home, though no longer owned by David and Martha, still stood. The apple tree had grown taller, its branches thick with blossoms every spring. The plaque by the sidewalk remained, and though the paint on the fence was flaking, the wooden sign under the tree still read, "In memory of Buster, he never gave up, so we wouldn't forget." The house was now owned by the Rosens, a young couple with 2 kids and a mutt named Charlie. Charlie was a wiry, half-beagle rescue with long ears, a nose that never stopped twitching, and an endless appetite for attention. He barked at birds, leaves, clouds, and sometimes at nothing at all. He was loud, happy, and seemingly without a serious thought in his floppy-eared head. But a few weeks after they moved in, Charlie changed. At first, it was subtle. He started sleeping near the back door instead of at the foot of the bed. He became quieter, more alert. He began to pace the yard, nose to the ground, tail low. He would sniff around the old apple tree, then walk to the center of the lawn and just stare at the ground. "What's he looking for?" Rachel Rosen asked one evening, standing at the window with a cup of tea. Her husband, Daniel, shrugged. "Probably just a smell. He's a beagle. Their brains are in their noses." But Charlie didn't lose interest. Every morning he would go outside, circle the same patch of grass, not the one where Buster had dug, but a little farther to the right, and paw gently at the dirt. Not enough to make a mess, just a few scrapes, like he was asking permission. One day, their daughter Ellie, 7 years old, curious and quiet, followed Charlie outside and watched him. "Why does he do that every day?" she asked her mom. "I don't know," Rachel said, "but maybe he's looking for something." Ellie thought about that. The next day, she brought Charlie a stick and laid it on the spot where he always pawed. "Here," she said, "you can have this." Charlie sniffed the stick, then sat beside it, quiet, still. That night, Ellie had a dream. She was standing in the backyard, but it was different, older, faded, like an old photograph. The apple tree was smaller, the fence was newer, and there was a girl standing under the tree. She had pigtails, a blue dress. She smiled at Ellie, pointed to the spot where Charlie always dug, and said, "He remembers me." Then the dream ended. Ellie told her mom the next morning. Rachel smiled politely, ruffled her daughter's hair, and said, "That's a nice dream, sweetie." But Ellie didn't forget. She began writing letters, little ones, folded in half and buried under pebbles by the tree. "Hi, my name is Ellie. You can visit me if you want. I'm sorry you were alone. You're not anymore." One day, she found a ribbon tied around one of the apple tree branches, pink, faded, like it had been there for years. No one in the family had put it there. Ellie didn't mention it. She just untied it carefully, folded it, and put it in her pocket. Weeks passed. Charlie continued his silent vigil, and then, one morning, a package arrived in the mail. No return address. Inside was a worn leather collar with a brass tag. It read, "Buster, hero of Hawthorne Lane." There was no note, just the collar. Rachel stared at it for a long time, then handed it to Ellie. "I think this belongs to you now." Ellie took it and placed it on her desk beside a photograph she'd drawn of a dog digging beside an apple tree and a little girl watching. At school, she was assigned a project on local history. Most kids chose topics like the town's founding or the library fire of '96. Ellie chose Buster. She stood at the front of the class holding her drawing and said, "A long time ago, a dog dug in his yard until he found someone everyone else forgot. Her name was Emily. She was 7, like me. Some people say dogs don't understand things, but I think they know more than we do. I think Buster didn't dig because he smelled something. I think he dug because he remembered her, because someone had to." There wasn't a dry eye in the room. Ellie got an A+, but more importantly, her teacher, a woman who had lived on Hawthorne Lane as a child, asked if she could keep a copy of the drawing. That night, Ellie went to the backyard with Charlie and sat quietly by the tree. The air was warm, The wind was still, and for just a second, no longer, Charlie stood, wagged his tail slowly, and looked toward the far corner of the yard. Ellie looked too. No one was there, but she smiled anyway. "Hi," she whispered. "I see you." Then she turned to Charlie and said, "Let's go inside." 3 years later, Ellie turned 10. By then, the story of Buster had become something of a local legend, a tale passed down in classrooms, printed on brochures at the community center, and painted into a mural on the side of the library. His likeness sat on a bench in bronze now, a life-sized sculpture, eyes turned toward the apple tree. Ellie still visited the backyard often, not out of routine, but out of reverence. The ribbon she'd once found was now pinned to her wall. The pink had faded to near white, but she remembered every dream, every whisper. Sometimes she left small things at the tree, drawings, stories, rocks shaped like hearts. Charlie, older now and slower, always sat beside her. He didn't dig any more, but some days he would lie next to the old marker, nose resting gently on the grass, like he was remembering something too. One crisp October evening, Ellie asked her mom if she could sleep in the backyard. Rachel hesitated. "You'll be cold." "I'll take blankets," Ellie promised. Charlie lay curled beside her that night, under a thick quilt. The air smelled of leaves and chimney smoke. The sky was clear, full of stars like salt scattered across velvet. Ellie drifted in and out of dreams. At some point in the night, she opened her eyes. The yard looked the same, only quieter, more still than she had ever known it. And at the far end, by the apple tree, stood a girl. She didn't move. She didn't speak. She was just there. Same pigtails, same blue dress. Ellie sat up, heart steady. "Emily?" she whispered. The girl tilted her head, smiled. Charlie didn't bark. He didn't growl. He simply sat up, ears perked, watching the same spot. Then the girl turned and pointed, not at the tree, not at the marker, but at Ellie. Then, slowly, at Charlie, and finally at the sky. Ellie didn't understand at first, but then she heard it, faint, so faint she thought she imagined it. A bark, not from Charlie, not nearby, from somewhere else, old, familiar, and full of joy. She looked up. The stars shimmered, the trees held their breath. Then, just for a second that didn't feel like any other, she saw two shapes running across the yard. A large golden blur, a small blue one beside it. Then they vanished, gone, but not. Ellie lay back down. She didn't cry. She didn't speak. She just smiled. The next morning, Rachel came out with Coco and found her daughter already awake, sitting up with the quilt around her shoulders. "You all right?" she asked gently. Ellie nodded. "I saw them." Rachel paused. "Saw who?" "Buster and Emily. They're okay now." Rachel didn't ask more. She sat beside her daughter, handed her the cup, and stared at the tree. The air felt different, not warmer, not brighter, but lighter. That winter, the apple tree stayed green longer than expected. In the spring, it bore twice as many apples as usual, and beneath its branches, kids came to visit, with school projects, with flowers, with letters folded in half and tucked under smooth stones. The town started calling it the Listening Tree, and on one plaque, carved into weathered cedar, were just 4 simple lines. Some dig with paws, some dig with hearts. Some stories end before they start, but if you sit and if you stay, the quiet ones still find their way. Charlie passed peacefully one summer morning the following year. He had grown slower, grayer, but until the very last week, he never missed a walk to the tree. The Rosens buried him near Buster, with a smaller marker, hand-painted by Ellie herself. She wrote only, "He listened too." Years later, when Ellie left for college, she visited the tree one last time before packing up. The house had changed, newer paint, a different kitchen, but the backyard felt untouched. She sat with her back against the bark, eyes closed, hand pressed to the ground. She whispered, "Thank you," to Buster, to Charlie, to the girl she had never met, but somehow always known. Then she stood, brushed off her jeans, and looked up at the sky. Nothing moved, no sound, but somewhere in the space between wind and memory, a bark echoed, and she smiled, because some stories never die, some dogs never stop digging, and some truths, no matter how long they sleep beneath the soil, will always find a way back to the light.